Ever get the feeling like your money? It just doesn't stretch as far as it used to.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not alone. We're going to be diving into the world of inflation today.
Okay.
And not just the prices are going up kind of inflation, but the sneaky hidden tax kind. We'll be exploring an article called Why Inflation is a Hidden Tax and How It's Destroying Wealth
Oh, wow.
by Dr. Chris Martenson. Buckle up, because Dr. Martenson doesn't hold back.
He certainly does not. What I find so fascinating about his approach is that he frames inflation as a type of fraud.
Well, fraud, like
Yeah.
someone running off with your wallet fraud? How does inflation fit into that?
Well, think of it this way. Fraud is essentially taking something from someone through deception, right?
Right. Yeah.
Inflation operates similarly. It diminishes the value of your money without your explicit consent, like a stealthy transfer of wealth from your pocket to the government. And who benefits? Governments and large institutions often do, while the everyday person is left footing the bill.
That makes sense. But we vote on taxes. We have debates about them. Inflation just seems to happen.
That's exactly what makes it so insidious, that lack of transparency, that lack of democratic process. Dr. Martenson really hits the nail on the head when he highlights the views of the famous economist Milton Friedman, who called inflation the most destructive disease of modern societies.
Wow. Strong words. But what did Friedman mean by that?
Friedman believed that inflation wasn't primarily caused by businesses raising prices or people spending too much, but by governments overspending and printing too much money.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty. How does this hidden tax actually pick our pockets? Dr. Martenson points to two main culprits: money supply expansion and government deficit spending. Can you break those down for us?
Absolutely. Imagine the economy as a swimming pool, and each cup of water represents a dollar. Money supply expansion is like pouring more and more water into the pool. As the pool overflows, each individual cup of water or dollar becomes less valuable. That's essentially what happens when the government prints more money. The value of each dollar decreases, leading to higher prices for everything.
So is that what happened during the pandemic? We saw prices skyrocket and everyone blamed it on COVID.
It was definitely a factor, but here's the thing. Dr. Martenson includes this chart that shows money printing was already contributing to inflation long before COVID.
Oh.
The pandemic simply poured gasoline on an already smoldering fire.
So it's like everyone was looking at the flames, but no one noticed the kindling had been there for ages.
Precisely. And this points to something Dr. Martenson argues. This wasn't just a temporary reaction to a crisis. It suggests a deliberate policy of inflation that was in motion long before 2020.
Okay, so that's money supply expansion.
Right.
What about government deficit spending? How did that play into this whole hidden tax scenario?
Think of it this way. When the government spends more than it takes in through taxes, it has to borrow money to cover the difference.
Right.
And how does it often borrow money? By creating more of it, which, as we just discussed, can lead to inflation. It's a vicious cycle.
And Dr. Martenson drops a pretty terrifying prediction here. He says U.S. government debt could hit a staggering $60 trillion by 2034.
Wow.
If that happens. What are we looking at? Financial Armageddon.
It's definitely a cause for concern. Such a massive debt burden could lead to runaway inflation, like we saw in some countries in the past. Imagine trying to buy a house, plan for retirement, or even just afford groceries, when the value of your savings is constantly shrinking.
So what does this all mean for us regular folks? Dr. Martenson dives into the consequences of inflation, starting with its impact on everyday people. He argues that it hits younger generations and lower income groups the hardest. Why is that?
It is. Younger generations and lower income groups are often dealing with stagnant wages and fewer opportunities for economic advancement. As the cost of living goes up due to inflation, they feel the squeeze more acutely than those with higher incomes or more assets. It's a recipe for discontent and instability.
And Dr. Martenson illustrates this with a pretty powerful anecdote. He talks about a young woman who's basically at her wit's end, expressing her anger and frustration at the system.
Yeah.
She's working hard, but barely making ends meet. And she sees more opportunity in other countries. It's a sentiment we're hearing more and more. What do you think this kind of widespread economic anxiety does to society?
Well, it erodes trust in institutions, for one. When people feel like the system is rigged against them, they lose faith in the powers that be, and that can be a dangerous breeding ground for social unrest and political instability.
It's not just about struggling to afford groceries either.
Yeah.
Dr. Martenson really emphasizes how insidious this hidden tax is, because even what economists call healthy inflation, like 2% a year, can stealthily eat away at your wealth over time.
That's right. Most people don't realize the long-term impact. They think, oh, 2%, that's not so bad. But what Dr. Martenson points out is that even at that rate, your purchasing power is significantly diminished over the long haul. It's like a slow leak in your tire. You might not notice it at first, but eventually you're going to be stranded.
So if we're all slowly getting financially deflated, who's benefiting from this? Is this really all a big accident? Or is Dr. Martenson right in suggesting that this is actually a deliberate policy choice?
Well, let's connect the dots. Governments and central banks often use inflation as a tool, a way to reduce the value of their debts and try to stimulate economic activity. In a sense, they're trying to solve short-term problems by passing the buck. Or should I say, the devalued buck, to future generations.
So it's like maxing out the credit card today
Yeah,
and hoping our kids figure out how to pay it off later.
it's not a perfect analogy, but you get the idea. And this brings us to what I think is the most crucial part of Dr. Martenson's argument, the broader societal damage that these policies can inflict.
Okay, let's unpack that. What are some of the long-term consequences that might not be immediately apparent?
Think about the fabric of society. Persistent inflation can exacerbate inequality, widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and make social mobility feel like a distant dream. It can fuel a sense of hopelessness, especially among those who are already struggling. The American dream starts to feel more like a fantasy than an attainable goal.
It paints a pretty bleak picture of where we could be headed. But if inflation is this destructive force, are there any life rafts? Is there anything we can do to protect ourselves?
Dr. Martenson proposes a few strategies, one of which is investing in tangible assets, like gold and silver.
Okay.
He argues that precious metals have historically held their value during times of economic turmoil and act as a store of wealth when fiat currencies are losing their purchasing power.
Okay, so gold and silver, the classic safe havens. But are they really a foolproof solution? Is there a catch?
Well, it's important to remember that gold and silver are still commodities, so their prices can fluctuate. They also don't generate income like stocks or bonds. And of course, if you're holding physical gold or silver, there are storage and security costs to consider.
So it's not a guaranteed win, but it's something to consider in this environment.
Exactly. It's about diversification, having a strategy that aligns with your financial goals and your risk tolerance. And it's about taking an active role in managing your wealth, rather than just letting it erode away.
That's great advice. And it aligns with Dr. Martenson's broader message. He's not just offering financial tips, he's issuing a call to action. He wants people to understand the forces driving inflation and hold policymakers accountable for decisions that impact their financial well-being.
What I find most compelling about his approach is that it's not just about personal finance. It's about understanding the system, questioning the assumptions we've been taught about economics, and challenging the status quo.
He really shines a light on the relationship between governments, financial institutions, and the public. If inflation is, as he argues, a deliberate policy choice, what does that say about the balance of power in our society? Who benefits? And who gets left holding the bag?
That's the question we should all be asking. It suggests a system where the interests of the few might take precedence over the well-being of the many. And it raises concerns about transparency, accountability, and who really holds the reins of power in our economy.
I have to admit, this deep dive has been a bit of a wake-up call. It can be pretty disheartening to realize that forces beyond our control might be manipulating the value of our hard-earned money.
Knowledge is power, though. The first step to change is awareness. Once we understand how the system works, and perhaps in some cases doesn't work, we can start looking for solutions, both individually and collectively.
So where do we go from here? What can we do as individuals to mitigate the impact of inflation and push for a more equitable economic system?
Start with education. Read books, articles, reputable websites. There's a wealth of information out there. Arm yourself with knowledge about inflation, its causes, and its consequences.
So don't just passively accept what you hear on the news or from politicians. Do your own research, explore different perspectives, and form your own conclusions.
Exactly. And then take action. Explore different investment strategies to protect your savings and grow your wealth over time. Think critically about your spending habits and make informed choices that align with your values.
It sounds like we need to be a lot more proactive and a lot less reactive when it comes to managing our finances in this environment.
Absolutely. Don't just treat inflation as an inevitable fact of life. Question it, challenge it, and explore ways to minimize its impact on your life.
But as you said, it's not just about personal finance. We need to tackle the systemic issues that are fueling this hidden tax in the first place.
Right. Engage in informed discussions about economic policy. Hold your elected officials accountable. Demand greater transparency from the institutions that control our financial system.
It's easy to feel powerless in the face of these complex economic forces. But we have a voice, and we need to use it.
Absolutely. We can't just sit back and let this insidious hidden tax erode our wealth and undermine our future. We need to be informed, engaged, and proactive in shaping the economic landscape.
This deep dive has been a whirlwind of information. Let's take a breath and recap the key takeaways from Dr. Martenson's article for our listeners.
He presents a compelling case for viewing inflation as a hidden tax, a mechanism that silently transfers wealth from the public to those in power. He identifies excessive money printing and government deficit spending as the primary drivers of this hidden tax. And he warns about the long-term consequences of these policies, not just for our wallets, but for the very fabric of society.
He also makes it clear that inflation doesn't impact everyone equally. Younger generations and those who are already economically disadvantaged often bear the brunt of it. And he doesn't just leave us with a doom and gloom message. He offers solutions both for protecting our individual wealth and for pushing for a more just and equitable system.
He also suggests that we seriously consider tangible assets like gold and silver as potential hedges against inflation. But as we discussed, it's crucial to do your own research and understand the potential risks before making any investment decisions.
So where do we go from here? What are some concrete steps our listeners can take to protect themselves and be part of the solution?
It all starts with knowledge. Dive deeper into the world of economics and personal finance. There are countless resources available online and in libraries.
Great advice. Don't rely on sound bites or headlines. Seek out in-depth information, explore a variety of perspectives, and make up your own mind. And don't just keep that knowledge to yourself. Talk to your friends and family about these issues. Share what you've learned. The more people who are aware of the hidden tax of inflation, the more we can start to push for real change.
Absolutely. It's about collective action. Support organizations that are fighting for economic justice and financial literacy. Get involved in local politics. Make your voice heard.
We'll be sure to include links to some of those organizations in our show notes. But even those small conversations around the dinner table can plant seeds and make a difference.
It all adds up. Remember, we're not just passive passengers on this economic roller coaster. We have the power to make informed choices, advocate for change, and build a better future for ourselves and future generations.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Dr. Martenson's article really got me thinking about the whole idea of the social contract. You know, that unwritten agreement between the government and the people. If inflation is indeed a deliberate policy choice, as he suggests, does that mean the system is actually working against us?
That's a question worth pondering. Is the current system really serving the best interests of the people? Or is it rigged to benefit a select few at the expense of the many?
It's a question that goes beyond just economics. It gets to the heart of democracy, representation, and the distribution of power. Do we just accept that our hard-earned money is slowly losing its value due to policies we have no control over? Or do we demand a system that prioritizes the well-being of all citizens, not just the privileged few?
Tough questions, but important ones. And it's up to each of us to find the answers.
Dr. Martenson actually suggests a concrete step. For listeners who are looking for ways to protect their wealth from this hidden tax, he recommends buying gold and silver, and even mentions a specific company, Goldcore, for those who are interested in exploring this option.
Of course, any investment decision should be made with careful research and an understanding of the risks, but the point is that we can take proactive steps to safeguard our financial futures in an environment where traditional savings and investments might not be enough.
It's about taking control, being empowered, and not just passively accepting the consequences of policies that might not be in our best interest.
Exactly. Be informed, be engaged, and be proactive. That's the key to navigating this complex economic landscape.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. We hope this deep dive into inflation has been enlightening and, dare I say, empowering for our listeners.
Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, keep asking those tough questions.
We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a topic that's shaping our world. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep challenging the status quo.